A very good afternoon, good evening, good morning if you happen to be in a different part of the world. Welcome to Dan Really Likes Wine, presented by Pick n Pay, and welcome to an evening of celebration, which probably most of these shows are really, because in all of them we celebrate some fabulous wine, some wonderful wine people, and it's always great fun today. But today we look at two particularly esteemed corners of the winemaking world. One involves bubbles and a winemaker who's celebrated around the world, and for very good reason. And the other is the latest in a family dynasty of people who turn red grapes into Cabernet Sauvignon with a touch of alchemy. And both of them have wines that really are top of the list when it comes to wines that people look for right around the world. Just before we kick in with them, though, a big thank you to everybody who joined us on the South African Wine Tribe in London and across the UK last night, with Greg Sherwood and Joe Waring from Wines of South Africa. Amongst them, Denzel Swartz from Simonsig, who's just absolutely fantastic and was wearing a very, very cool shirt. So I have high hopes for a Simonsig colleague who I'll be speaking to in just a moment. We also got to catch up with Ian Nordier and chat about his Mourvedre dessert wine, which is so different but so nice. And if you don't like that overly sweet dessert wine, then this is a very nuanced, very understated version of the wines we tend to keep for after dinner and don't use that often. I think we should be drinking them all the time and more often. But perhaps that Mourvedre will start to swing a few people into that particular space. And we also got to spend some time with Gavin Brouwer from the Rats Family Vineyards, talking about the Jasper, which is a terrific Cabernet Franc-led red blend, and another triumph for South African Cabernet Franc, which has stepped firmly out from the shadows this year and has become a grape to be reckoned with on its own terms, rather than simply a bit part in red blend. So some lovely wine last night. If you are watching from the UK and you missed it, well, do join us. Our next one will be in February, and we'll keep you posted on details of that. So today, a little later, Christo Le Riche is the member of the Le Riche family. We chat to his father, Etienne, wrote the book pretty much on making Cabernet Sauvignon in Stellenbosch. We're going to try some vintage Cabernet Sauvignon, as well as seeing what the newer vintages are like. But we kick off with somebody who, if I was him, I certainly wouldn't be able to do an interview now, because I'd still be recovering from the celebrations, and huge celebrations they deserve to be. The Diners Club Winemaker of the Year. He hails from Simonsig. His name is Johan Malan, and it's a great pleasure to have him with us. Johan, good evening.
Good evening, Dan, and thank you very much for having us. It's a great pleasure to be here.
You look in a far better condition than you deserve to be, because you should still be running around Simonsig in your underwear, throwing bottles in the sky and downing them. Congratulations. It's a fabulous accolade. Well done.
Yeah, thank you very much. I must say, I never expected it to be such a big event, and all the congratulations I received. It took me a while to calm down, but it really feels great at the end of such a year where we needed to end it with some fantastic news. So I'm really, really stoked.
It's a tribute to you as a winemaker, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But it's also a very rich tribute to Simonsig and its heritage. We spoke a little about this last night when we chatted to Denzel, who's fabulous. We also spoke to Charles last week. Not everybody knows this, so perhaps a little history lesson. When we say that you guys are the pioneers of Cup Classique, we really mean it, because 50 years next year, you gave us our very first bottle.
That's right. My father, Frans, was the first winemaker to do bottle fermentation in South Africa in 1971. Incidentally, also the year when he was one of the founders of the Stellenbosch wine route. So next year we'll have a big celebration. The interesting thing about Kaapse is that for the first 10 years, it was the only Nicholl Champenoise in South Africa until the second one arrived, which was made by Achim von Arnhem at Boschendal. So it is a celebration not only for Simonsig, but also for the whole category of Cup Classique that has grown really spectacularly in the past 20 years or so, with more than 200 wine producers now doing Cup Classique in South Africa, which is a huge increase in the numbers, because when we started the Cup Classique Association in 1992, there were only 14 of us who signed the the constitution. So, in less than 30 years, it's really grown by leaps and bounds.
When you talk about 200 producers now, it seems crazy that it was only 49 years ago that we saw our first one, given just how long we've been making wine in the Cape. What was the delay, do you think? And then what was your dad's inspiration to say, now's the time to give us a crack?
I think at that time, it was all about making sparkling wine using the carbonation method, which was obviously a lot cheaper, so it could meet certain price points. And in the days when people had sparkling wine at weddings, they referred to it as champagne, although we weren't allowed to put champagne, the name, on the label. But it used to be very, very sweet. So the main category was my father went on a trip to France and went to Champagne, where he saw how they make bottle fermented champagne, and came back with the idea to do something similar in South Africa, because one shouldn't forget that in the late 60s, early 70s, South Africa had a huge shortage of all the international grape varieties like Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, German Riesling, etc. Even Merlot and those varieties were not available. So he was a bit frustrated with the limitations. So he had a Chenin Blanc under the Simonsig label, a Claret Blanche, believe it or not, and a Riesling. And he wanted to do something more. So he actually started making the first cups of Unkel using Chenin Blanc, but it had bottle fermentation and so therefore sparkling wine. And that was a whole new category because nobody else had done it before. And interestingly, that when he released the wine, must have been about 1972, it was the most expensive white wine in South Africa at R3 a bottle.
It's hard to believe that things have changed quite so dramatically in such a short space of time. I'm interested to know, have you tried that first ever vintage, and if so, what was it like?
I was much younger then, and I remember that quite often he would open a bottle on a Sunday at the lunch table. And I still remember it, and I think it actually sort of formed a lot of my ideas about the Kaapse Funkel and Cap Classique. And one must remember, using only Chenin Blanc, it's actually classified as a Blanc de Blanc because we only used white grapes. And for me, Chenin Blanc is one of the intrinsics of the variety, is this very prominent crispness of the acidity. So when you do it for Cap Classique, you also pick it quite early. So in normal days, one would pick 22, 23 degrees barreling. But when you do bottle fermentation, you want to have a high acidity, but without too much alcohol that would allow the second fermentation in the bottle. So I remember it as the characters of sort of slightly underripe grapes with a lot of green apple, and that took a long time to soften, and it needed to be quite matured before it developed enough complexity. But in 1987, we finally had sufficient quantities of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. So then I was already in the cellar for about 5 years. And so I changed the cuvee to use only Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And then also doing a trip to Champagne in 1990, I was quite puzzled by why do they plant so much Pinot Meunier, which is the third variety of Champagne. And we don't even have it in South Africa at all. So try to source some cuttings and plant the first vineyard in 1994. So the first time we included Pinot Meunier was in 1997. So that was the first Cap Classique as well that had all three of the French Champagne varieties. So now that you're using red grape, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier and Chardonnay, there's a huge difference for me with the way those varieties mature and how they develop in the bottle. I think that for me, it does have a lot more richness, complexity that come with time, as opposed to the Chenin Blanc. So the Chenin, I think, is great when you do it for a very youthful wine and to be consumed early. So that gives you the freshness, the crispness, very good in that respect. But I think Cap Classique has just got so much more ability to mature when you use the classic champagne varieties.
It does, of course, also need a rather adept winemaker at the helm to ensure that the product reaches the heights that it has the potential to, which brings us back to you and to your award. In terms of just making the wine, of waving the flag for Simonsig Cap Classique, do you feel a little bit of pressure? Is there a weight on the shoulders occasionally, knowing that you are the guardian of the oldest Cap Classique and you're also following in the family footsteps?
Yes, I think so. Maybe more so when I was in the early days of my career, we actually knew so little. It was very difficult to gather information because most of the publications you could find were all in French, and the French only spoke French. So it was hard to read up and to expand your knowledge, and that was quite frustrating, and actually led to me inviting some of the other winemakers in 1988 and say, but listen, let's taste each other's base wine. So people like Achim von Arnhem, Hilko Hegovich, Jeff Greer, they all came with their base wine. Because the interesting thing about Cap Classique is what you put in the bottle is not what you put in the glass eventually. You know, it goes through a complete metamorphosis, second fermentation, and maturation on the lees. Then you remove the yeast. You add a bit of dosage just to round it off again. So the pressure is actually, what must the cuvee taste like? What is quality when you have to judge it before it's actually bottled and it goes through the second fermentation? So I think that was the main challenge, and that's where the sharing of knowledge in the Cap Classique Association was incredible. It's still going on today. That base wine tasting still happens every year. So anybody that's new to the game can bring their base wine, and then the guys with more experience will give them free advice, comments, and give them sort of direction of which way to go. So the great thing about the Cap Classique is that it's so early in the year. You just come back from your summer holidays, your head's clean, apart from a bit of beach sand behind your ears. But in general, you take on the new vintage with new energy, and that means that you're really focused, because it is an intense time of the year, but very enjoyable, good fun.
Well, the focus and intensity paid off even more than usual with this award that you now have, Diners Club Winemaker of the Year. But for people who don't know how it works, explain the system, because I know it changes each year in terms of a certain type of wine, how it works, and then why you think this particular wine did the job for you.
Yeah, Diners Club Winemaker of the Year has been running for 40 years. So this year was the 40th award. And what makes it special is the fact that it's only about one category, one style or grape variety every year. So it also needs a little bit of luck, that you must have a certain quantity of that wine in stock. So it has to be available to the consumer. And then you enter the competition, and a panel of expert judges. This year it was chaired by Carrie Adams, and they then do the selection, and they chose 6 finalists. And in that finalists, we actually had 2 Kaapse The one was the 2015 vintage, and the other one was a 2010. So fortunately, it gave me sort of 2 horses in the race. And eventually the winning wine was the 2015 vintage Kaapse. So also an indication that the wine is 5 years old. So it has had the opportunity to develop and show a bit of evolution in the bottle. And that is really almost like a red wine. You need that extra time for the characters to develop, because when it's young, it's fairly tight, very linear, and almost a bit closed, but with a lot of the primary freshness of the Chardonnay Pinot Noir. But with time on the yeast, that evolution takes place, and the wine becomes a lot more rich and creamy, with a bit of butter toast and a bit of that yeastiness, which is so desired in the wine. So on top of that, 2015, we all know, was one of the greatest vintages in the Cape for a long time. So one tends to think that it's only for red wine, but actually it proves that it also worked wonders for the quality of Cab Classique like this one.
Right, well, I'm not going to take your word for it, Johan. I'm going to be very professional and taste it myself, just to make sure you are indeed telling the truth. So, oh, yeah, I think the jury's still out, Johan. I'm not sure I could drink more than 5 or 6 bottles of this at a time, I'm afraid. It's this
time of the year.
It's an absolutely fantastic wine. If Carrie Adams gives it thumbs up, and she drinks more than anybody I know, so that's clearly an endorsement. But one of the features that I love about this, and I love about the fact that both of your wines made the top 6, is they've both got that bottle age. They've both got some vintage to it, and it's something I think we're getting a bit better at in South Africa, but we still don't do enough of, and that's taking note of the vintage on a Cab Classique and giving the wine that's had the time and effort of people like yourselves the reward to just age that little more, to grow a little more, and to give us in turn the reward as the drinkers of that wine.
Yeah, I think South Africa is different from France, where in Champagne a very small percentage of Champagne is actually vintage dated, something like 3 or 4%. It's only done in the very best vintages, because mostly the non-vintage champagnes is a blend of various different vintages, and they do that so that they can maintain a certain house style and a certain quality, because in the Northern Hemisphere, they tend to have a lot more variance from one vintage to the next. And in South Africa, we are very blessed that we don't have those peaks and valleys. So the use of reserve wine and doing the blending of different vintages is not that much done, or that big requirement. But that means we put the vintage on the bottle, and that also makes it interesting that you actually know how old the wine is. And the other thing that I always find fascinating about Cab Classique is that, in the bottle, after the second fermentation, the evolution, the maturation of the wine takes place, but at a relatively slow rate, because the yeast sort of holds back the development of the wine. It keeps it fresh, it keeps it reductive, and obviously there's also no oxygen in the bottle. And then after the disgorgement, the yeast is removed, a little bit of oxygen does get in, and on the cork there's also the possibility of oxygen exchange between the atmosphere inside the bottle, and then the tempo of the wine's development speeds up. So this 2015 was a bottle in late 2015 and then disgorged in 2017. So roughly about 2 years on the yeast, and then the last 3 years on the cork. So I think that found the perfect balance between the brightness of the fruit of the young wine, as well as the further aging on the yeast. And I think that's what we always look for, is to have that harmony between the two characters, or the two components of the flavor. If it's too fresh, it can be quite linear, and if it's too much aging, it tends to become too aldehydic, is the technical word, and that's a little bit of an acquired taste.
You have a terrific wine here, as the award suggests, and that's going to make it, I'm sure, particularly special to you. It'll be a vintage you're always going to remember with great fondness. If you were to open a bottle to celebrate this victory, but that bottle is another vintage. What comes after this for you from all the wine that you've made over the years that really stands out and would sit alongside this as one of your greats?
Interestingly, you will know that after 2015 came the 2017 vintage, and there's a bit of a debate going already that maybe 2017 is as good as 2015. Our 2017 Kaapse is definitely, for me, one with a lot of potential. It's still that 2 years younger. And then we also have our Cuvée Royale, which is our Blanc de Blanc, so only Chardonnay is used. And that normally spends 5 years on the yeast before we release it. We actually now on the 2017 vintage because we had no 2016, and it came around a bit quicker than we planned. But both of those wines, I think, come from that fantastic 2017 vintage. So both of them, I think, have got the potential to go a long way still. So if I run out of the 15, there's at least more of the 2017 to celebrate with.
It's a debate that is getting plenty of people engaged at 15 versus 17. And it's lovely that we have these debates because it says that we are consistently producing wonderful vintages. Just before I let you go, we've got a Cabernet Sauvignon maker raring to taste some wine with us. I'm going to ask you about one last vintage, Johan, and not necessarily just about bubbles, but generally. What was the year 2000 like for Simonsig?
2000.
Any recollection?
Yeah, that's 20 years ago. I have a few recollections. The one was there was a huge fire on the Simonsberg, and I was actually with my in-laws and their family from Australia up in the Pilanesberg, and on the way back to the airport, I heard on the radio that there's a huge fire, and they mentioned all the farms of the people, they sort of next door neighbors. And it really gave me a fright because it was an exceptionally hot year. 2000 was the millennium year, so it was a big vintage, symbolically, and the first vintage of the new millennium after the Y2K problems. But it was hot, and I remember the red wines were really big and bold and very powerful with big tannin structures. So we all thought they're going to last forever. I think stylistically we were also making wines in those days that were almost a little bit like the Robert Parker. So very high level of ripeness, big alcohols, and I think gladly, unfortunately, we've moved away from that. So that's my recollection of 2000. Maybe more of a red wine vintage than white or Cap Classique.
Well, I'm actually very glad you say that because in passing, I've used my Corovan, which is my new favorite tool in the Dan Really Likes Wine cellar, to plunge through the cork of a 2000 France Malan, which I just happen to have. Yep. And so I've put a little into the glass. I haven't tried it yet. I've been waiting for this quite excitedly, pretending to listen to all the talk about Cap Classique before I tried this. So, all right. You can see it's got that little bit of rustiness to it.
Well, that's our Cape blend with mainly Pinotage, Cabernet Sauvignon, and a dash of Merlot.
Well, I'll tell you what, Johan, that has held its own very well indeed for 2 decades on. It's maybe not 100% at its peak, but it's not very far off. And it goes into the category of wines I'm not planning to share with anybody else.
Well, now you've used the Corovan. It's you can either decide to finish the whole bottle or you can leave the rest for later.
No, well, it is drinking beautifully, as is that Cap Sauvignon. We've got a couple of people who agree there. Michelle Stradham is watching on Facebook. Simonsig Cap Sauvignon is my favorite MCC, says Michelle. And she follows up moments later with France Malan is a great wine, absolutely delicious. So you've got a big fan there amongst those watching today. Johan, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate the time, and congratulations. That Diners Club Award is a sought-after one. It's not given out lightly, and it's been given to a great winemaker for a great wine. So congratulations.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate it, and very nice talking to you. And all the best for the Christmas season, and the best of luck for the new year. You know, we all need a 2021 that's a little bit more uplifting than the past one.
We certainly do, and I suspect many of us will be saying goodbye to one year and hello to the next with bubbles. And the Simonsig Cups of Uncle with a Dinemaker's Award is certainly one to include in your list. Johan, thank you very much. Take care and have a wonderful festive break.
Cheers. Thank you.
So there we go. The Diners Club Winemaker of the Year for 2020, Johan Malan, carrying on that fabulous tradition of Cup Classique out of Simonsig. The first Cups of Uncle, 1971. Next year, the 50th anniversary of Cup Classique in South Africa. There's going to be a lot of celebration. I know friends at Pick and Pay have got a lot of exciting stuff planned, and I suspect all of our big Cup Classique makers will be doing something of consequence to mark the occasion. So, some great wine made by somebody who's following in the footsteps of his dad, which is exactly what we're going to do with our next guest. His dad is a legend, and I don't say that in the anybody can be a legend way that we normally employ it these days. He truly is one of the Stellenbosch greats, and his son has picked up the baton and run with it in terms of the wine they make down at Le Riche, which means our guest can only be Christo Le Riche joining us to talk some Cabernet Sauvignon. Christo, very good evening. Welcome.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Great pleasure. There's a nice symmetry with two sons of great winemakers, Johan following on from France, yourself following on from Etienne. How challenging is it being the son of the great Etienne Le Riche making wine? Everybody's going to expect, well, he's Etienne's son. Etienne turns Cabernet Sauvignon grapes into miracles. You've now got to try and do exactly the same and better.
Yeah, that's it is a bit of a daunting task, and I think you always ask the question of, will I be able to get there? Do I have the same skill set and so forth? But yeah, I guess you've got to scratch out your own space, do things your own way, but keep to the traditions, learn your lessons, be humble, and then in the end of the day, I've had an incredible teacher and kind of a master to work under. So the bottom line is that you're always sitting with that. My dad's kind of built in and ingrained in both myself and my sister a great love for wine, and just that inherent, you can probably call it gut feel, because I've been watching him do it for so many years that kind of comes back into your own ways and your own styles of making wines. And fortunately enough, we agree when it comes to especially Cabernet as to what we like and what we want to make. So it's actually been quite an easy transition, just stepping in and following in his footsteps, and hopefully I'll be able to stand in his shoes one day.
Let's talk about this formula that seems to work so well. Cabernet Sauvignon grapes plus Le Riche terroir plus a member of the Le Riche family equals absolutely fantastic Cabernet Sauvignon. What are those elements that you think come together to create this formula so successfully?
Good grapes. Without good grapes, we just simply won't get there. So I've been fortunate enough to inherit a few vineyards from my dad, which we work with grapes from around Stellenbosch. So we don't. We've got sites that we're buying in from, which include the Jonkershoek Valley, the Simonsberg Mountain, Upper Helderberg, and then on the lower foothills of the Helderberg is also a lot of our grapes are coming from that region. And one of the big components of our reserve is a block that my dad started working with in 1999, and I'm working with that same block today. So, and it's remained a feature vineyard in the portfolio that we're working with. But I mean, over time, vineyards change and you work with it, but it's really about taking the soils of Stellenbosch. Stellenbosch is the heartland of Cabernet. Probably one of the regions in the world for producing great Cabernet. And it actually makes it quite easy. You just take a couple of good Cabernet vineyards, you ferment them and don't mess them up, let them show themselves, blend them together, and you get a great cab.
And you do. You make it sound enormously easy. I'm thinking even I could possibly do this when I know that I certainly couldn't. You have as not just an estate, but as a region, elevated Cabernet Sauvignon into a cultivar that's known around the world. If it's Stellenbosch and it's Cabernet Sauvignon, we're going to expect something special. And that's led into the Cabernet Collective. I have this vision of you all having late night secret meetings in dark cellars, coming up with more ways to expand the Cabernet story. Tell us a little bit about that and why this collective passion is so important to keep this Cabernet story going.
I won't really say that we sit in dark corners in cellars just drinking cab the whole day long. It was actually Johan Malan and I and a couple of other producers got together, and we just said that there's this great story to tell, and it wasn't being told. So I think the motivation behind creating the Cab Collective was simply to get a grouping to basically get all the Stellenbosch cab producers together, pool our resources, combine the story, and really start to fine-tune the story of what Stellenbosch Cabernets are. It's a story that didn't really need much creativity, if I can put it that way, because it was already there. Everybody knows Cabernets are great. We've all tasted the Zonneblooms from the 50s and the Lanzeracs and the Kanonkops and the Meerlists and the Rustenburgs, and then the Rustenfredas came along, the Ernie Elses, the Waterfords, the Stark Condés, the Le Riche steps to the line. You've got Olderberg, you've got Bartony, Glen Ellie's recently stepped into the scene as well. And then you've got a couple of the young guys starting to play with it now as well. So it's actually a very easy story to tell. So what we did is we just said, well, let's get together, let's pool our resources, let's figure out this region and really start to pinpoint what makes Stellenbosch Cabernet great and why does it achieve the greatness that it does? Why does it achieve the aging potential that it does? And let's just start telling the story behind it.
We have French tourists who come and visit South Africa, and some of them are quite surprised by the fact that they'll go into an area that's making Cabernet Sauvignon, but they're also making Shiraz and they're making Cabernet Franc and doing all the things you can't do in France, where if you're in a particular area, you make a particular grape, and that is how it works. How do you strike the balance? Somebody like yourself, you don't only make Cabernet Sauvignon. The cab you make is fantastic, but you make and have to sell other wines. With an area like Stellenbosch, making sure that, yes, the Cabernet Sauvignon is celebrated, but you don't lose track of the other great wine stories that you have as well.
Well, I think, firstly, if you're talking to a Frenchman, they don't drink anything else than French wine. They're extremely biased. So they will definitely not believe that there's any other wine outside of the borders of France in the first place. But that's French arrogance, which we all love and hate at the same time. I think the beauty of Stellenbosch is lying in its diversity. And it's something that's been said multiple times over, but I think anybody who's traveled into Stellenbosch has seen the mountains. As Ken Forrester says, we've got the 5 mountains in Stellenbosch, and you're sitting with the Simonsberg mountain in the north, which is topping out over 1,000 meters above sea level, and all the ravines. You've got the age of the soils, and we can keep going on about all the beautiful stuff that there is about growing wines in Stellenbosch. But what it comes down to is we've got pockets, and in those pockets there are great wines that need to be discovered, and it takes years to figure out what works best in what regions. In terms of Cabernets, we have seen that there are certain regions and certain areas that are just producing outstanding Cabernets, and that's probably going for the largest component within Stellenbosch. So that's why Cabernet is the largest planted red grape and probably the leading grape variety within the region. But that doesn't mean that you're ignoring great wines that are coming from, for example, Shiraz. And if you think Rustenfreda blends Shiraz with their cabs, guys like Clermont and de Trafford are known for their Shiraz in that little upper portion of the Blauwklippen. Rien and Bormann and Reinecker with those valleys are doing some great Shirazes as well. There's some beautiful Chardonnay sites high up on the Simonsberg, high up on the Helderberg Mountain as well. Some beautiful Sauvignon Blancs coming from near the ocean. There's some Merlot, there's some Cab Franc, as Brera has proved. So it's actually a story that tells itself, because what works, if you taste it in the glass, it's delicious, and that's in the end what's going to sell. But in Stellenbosch, within this beauty and the diversity that there does seem to be this hero grape that's standing out, and that is Cabernet, and that's why we're passionate about it. But I'm a bit biased to ask that question because I really don't work with much else than Cabernet. That's 80-90% of what we do. We only do 3 wines, of which 2 are 100% Cabs. And the third one is vast majority Cabernet. So yeah, I'm a little bit biased.
I think you're completely objective. Wouldn't disagree with anything at all. You can afford to, of course, because you have that focus, and it's a focus that's been rewarded. I think Greg Sherwood, both the best versed man in the UK about South African wine and the worst dressed by some distance, in July did a tasting. I think he lined up 3 of your vintages with one of the French vintages, I think, and yours came out glowingly compared to the 3 of them. And the one that really caught his attention was 2017. We spoke to Johan a little earlier about the 2015 versus 2017 debate. 15 showing itself quite early, bit of a rock star wine. 17 a little more aristocratic, slightly more restrained, but coming into its own with every passing week almost. Give us your thoughts on those 2, and in particular, I've got some 2017 Cab here, which I'm about to have a little sip of, and whether you think 17 is a year that can surpass what everybody thought in 15 would be one of the best we'd see in our lifetimes.
We've been very blessed to be able to work with those 2 vintages, and I think it's really up to personal preference as to which way you're going to be leaning. I'm starting to tip over that I actually prefer 17 to 15 at the moment. The wines, and I think what it came down to is we had a little bit longer season that kind of ripened a little bit later into the season as well, where 15 was quite early. It was actually 15 was the earliest vintage my dad had ever seen in his career for picking Cabernets. We were picking Cabs in the second week of Feb, which is extremely early and actually quite unusual. But that went with the entire vintage shifting early and starting early at the end of August. So I love 15s on our wines because of the elegance that has come through, and there's a lovely tannin seam and a lot of linearity in the wines. But they're going to, for me, on our reserve, it's going to take time to really showcase itself. Where the 17, I think, is a little bit more friendly. There's a lot of fruit sitting in the wines. Amazing tannins. It's the highest level of tannins I've ever seen in our wines. And I think that combination, they always say great Cabernet is an iron fist in a velvet glove. It's got to feel like somebody's punching you, but it's actually quite nice. It's kind of soft when they hit you. And that's the idea behind the tannin structure. You've got this powerful tannin on the palate, but it's completely coated in fruit. And that goes into a nice long finish. And that's what I found in 17s. And for me personally, I would probably tip the 17 to 15 by about 0.01%.
And again, as I said to Johan, it's so cool that we can have these conversations, that we've got vintages that were so good that it's difficult to work out which one is better. And I love that fact of it. I'm in 2 minds as well. I genuinely, when people first started saying to me, I think 17 could be better than 15, I laughed at them and told them they knew nothing about wine. And now I pretend not to have had that conversation with them, as I tell them I think 17 might be better than 15. Again, though, as you say, personal preference, and it's great to try them together. I do have another Le Riche to try, though, and this is open. It's actually the reason I wanted to have you on this evening, because I was going to open these wines anyway. I've got some close friends coming around for dinner, and so I wanted to open up something special. I bought these at the Strauss auction, the auction that has accounted for my children's university fund. So they won't get to stay university, but I'll get to drink nice wine, which I'm quite comfortable with. And this, let me actually find the bottle so you can see it. This is the 2010 Cabernet Sauvignon Reserve from the good people at Le Riche, which I've had 1 bottle of already. And I was really in 2 minds, Christo, and I'd appreciate your counsel. I had the first bottle and it was glorious. And I was thinking, it's drinking so beautifully at the moment, but I suspect it could probably drink beautifully for a little while longer. And so I sort of ummed and ahed a bit. And I'm keeping the rest of the case, but I'm going to open a couple of bottles of it tonight. Tell us a little bit about what you know of this particular vintage, and just how much more time I should maybe be keeping those other 3 bottles for.
So that 2010 was kind of the changeover vintage between my father and myself. 2009 was the last vintage when my father made all the harvest calls. And then in 2010, we dovetailed. I was still doing my honors degree at Stellenbosch at that stage, part-time, but also making the harvest calls on quite a few of the vineyards. And my dad still kind of helped out on the other side, where 2011 was the first vintage where I completely took over the winemaking side of things. So it's really an amalgamation of the two of us coming into that 27 after 2010 vintage. That was 2 vineyards, both of them are lying in the lower slopes of the Helderberg. And they're both vineyards that have since then gone into our reserve every year up until now. And both vineyards I really, really love and enjoy, but very, very different in character. But on that wine specifically, and one of the reasons we put that onto the Strauss & Co. auction was that we felt the wine is now stepping into its drinking age. And I think that's kind of a general rule of thumb you can follow on most Stellenbosch Cabernets, is that at around 10 years old, it is a great time to start drinking your cabs. If you open them at 10 years and they're a little bit more developed, you can just finish the case. Or if you realize the wine is still young, you can give it a little bit more time, as is the case with this 2010. So personally, we tasted that wine last week as well, and it's a great wine for drinking at the moment. And I would happily open it up. And I do think it's going to develop and change over the next 5 years as well. So it's one of those where, for me, it's a tough decision. If you kind of open the bottle and you like it, drink the entire case. Or if you have the discipline and you can actually wait as long as you can, then kind of do 1 bottle a year, see how it goes. But I think if you give that wine even another 10 years, it's still going to sit there. There's enough tannin and structure behind it that it will still go quite a long time from here.
My challenge is not so much the discipline, Christo. It's that I travel a lot. And my wife has got a key to my cellar. And once she's tasted something she likes, and this she likes, it tends to evaporate. And I don't have too much control of it, especially as she is a lawyer. It is drinking beautifully. We never get too technical on this particular show, but talk us through. You said you were drinking it last week. Talk us through for the people who are watching this enviously and salivating as a 10-year-old Stellenbosch Cabernet Sauvignon gets poured, what we're finding in this and what makes it stand out for you right now.
So for me, the wine has got a lovely fine tannin structure, and that was something that 2010 really had. There was lovely ripe wines that came through. So the tannins have got a very fine, almost a kind of a chalky style on the palate. So if you don't know what that feels like, you've got to just use your imagination of sucking on a little bit of chalk, but it's kind of fruity and pleasant at the same time. It's a little bit weird, but yeah, that's kind of the best way to describe it. The fruit for me has got this lovely black fruit in it. It's a little bit more dark chocolate as well. There's a little bit of pencil lead that's coming through in the background. And it's also got a little bit of that mocha kind of character sitting far in the background, coming from the oak influences, obviously, on the wines. But it's also developed into that tertiary kind of characters that are also coming through, where you're starting to see that bottle age coming through. The rim of the wine has got a little bit more of that bricky color, and it's starting to move away from the more purple that you'll see on the younger wines. And there's a little bit of that dried herb character coming in the background, which is what we like to call fynbos as well, which is typical of Cabernet. If Cabernets don't have that little bit of a herby, leafy edge on the background, then it's not Cabernet really. And so yeah, you've got all those contexts and those elements coming in, which is starting to allure to a lovely wine that's got great complexity, and you can just sit down and just drink a lovely glass of Cab.
I have sitting about 30 feet from me now inside the kitchen a large pile of lamb shanks that have been slowly cooking for about 4 hours now. So this wine has a wonderful companion for a little later on this evening. I can't wait to pair them up. My only sadness is that I'm opening it for a table of about 7 people, so I'm not going to get quite as much of the wine as I would have liked. But it's good friends for dinner, so happy to share it. On that note of sharing, just before we do say goodbye to you, Christo, one of the things I love about our winemaking community is that sense of sharing, of backing each other up, of supporting each other. You've already referenced the Cabernet Collective and the work that you guys do together. For somebody who's looking get hold of some Cabernet Sauvignon at the moment, maybe something that they haven't heard of, don't know about, something a little new, something a little unexpected. You're obviously one of the well-established big guns of Cabernet Sauvignon. Who's new on the Cabernet Sauvignon scene? Who's exciting you at the moment with Stellenbosch Cab?
Oof, that's a really tough question to answer. The reality is with Cabernet, a lot of the old established producers are the ones that are doing great wines. You can't talk about Cabernet when you're not talking about the great wines coming off Nicholl, Rustem Vrede. Those are producers that have really established themselves over a long period of time. I'm liking the new Rustem Vrede wines that are coming out. They've restrained a little bit in the ripeness, and they've got this lovely tension sitting on the wines. The 21 Gables from Spear is always one of my favorites. It's kind of a single vineyard that's coming off high off the Helderberg Mountain that's looking really good. Kiermont with Alex Sterry has actually started doing a single vineyard Cabernet coming off their property, which is some interesting wines to look out for. Then Stark Conde has recently released what they call their Eau de Nectar, which is a single vineyard that is sitting extremely high up in the mountain. It's a small block completely surrounded by fynbos, sitting right in that wind channel that's coming off the Jonkershoek Valley. It's actually a block that burnt down twice already while they were starting to grow it up, and it's produced some absolutely amazing wines as well. And well, there's just a diversity of great stuff to look at. So Hartenberg's have got some really good stuff. Kaapstad has got some beautiful wines. The 2018 Long Fuse from Jordan I tasted this afternoon, and that was great. And we can go on and on and on and on. Glen Elly is starting to really come into their own with the wines they're producing. Tukara has got some amazing stuff. Those last few wines coming from Miles has really been very, very good. And then keep an eye out for Miles's own projects as well. I think that's a producer to keep to watch as well as the Miles Mossop wines coming to their own. So yeah, there's a lot to talk about going on in Stellenbosch. Beautiful wines coming out, and it's really hard to find a bad cab at the moment in Stellenbosch because it's really the guys are pushing each other and doing some really good stuff.
Yeah, it is a kind of a how long is a piece of string question, but you answered it deftly and with some great suggestions as well, Christo. So you're probably the only one I'd add in there. I had some of Erica Obermeyer's Cabernet Sauvignon recently that I think she got from Stellenbosch, which was magnificent. But don't worry, Erica. Christo hates your wine. He's not interested in it. Absolutely fine. Great selection, great addition. The headline certainly this evening in the Nicholl household by the Le Riche. Which is just drinking absolutely gorgeously. And I think if there's a key takeaway from Christo, it's if you can, that top Cabernet Sauvignon, give it 10 years, hold out, and your patience will be richly rewarded. Christo, thank you very much for your time, for some great wine, for continuing your dad's legacy. You're giving us some wonderful, wonderful Cabernet Sauvignon, and it's such an important part of our South African wine story. So keep it up, keep making terrific wine, and I shall keep spending my children's inheritance on it quite happily.
Great, Dan. Glad I could help you to spend your inheritance. But as my dad always says, he's not going to leave a single bottle of wine in his wine cellar when he dies. He's going to finish it all, which I think is a very important statement to have.
Which might be the reason for saying goodbye if there's as much wine in that cellar as I suspect. Christo, thank you. Take care. Look forward to having you back on the show again soon. Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. Christo Le Riche from the Le Riche dynasty, making such utterly sublime Cabernet Sauvignon. It really is little Cabernet Sauvignon in the world that outstrips the best we have from Stellenbosch, and Le Riche sits firmly at the top of that particular list. So that wraps us up, not just for the week, but we're getting close to wrapping up for the year. Next week will be our last week of the live tastings, next Monday and Thursday. Monday, I think, I stand under correction, but I think we're going to be chatting to the team at Kleine Zalze, who are the Platter Winery of the Year and the Old Mutual Trophy overall winery of the year. They won the most trophies. So catching up with Alistair, and I'm hoping we're chatting to Grendel as well. And then next Thursday, some very special guests summing up their best wines of 2020 before we call it a break for Christmas, indulge wildly, and then hit 2021 with all sorts of great intentions to sign gym contracts and go running every morning and turn vegan and generally be better versions of ourselves. So the easiest way to do that is to drink great South African wine and enjoy the journey that wine affords us And as we've seen this evening through our Diners Club Winemaker of the Year, Johan Malan, and Le Riche's Christo Le Riche, we've got wine in fabulous hands that is delivering such great results. Big thank you to everybody who's joined us today. I see Grant Sauls picking up on the 2017 vintages, doing really well. They certainly are, Grant, and I know you have a number of them and have been a great supporter, one of many of Dan Really Likes Wine this year. Do enjoy the rest of your week. Keep drinking South African wine. Keep supporting South African wine. And if you haven't already, grab hold of your Pick n Pay Smart Shopper card. Send your number through to 36775 to join the Pick n Pay Wine Club. It is free of charge. Pick n Pay is awash with fantastic South African wine. And as a wine club member, you'll get 3 times the Smart Shopper points on all the wine you buy, 20% off 10 different wines each month. Plus, there's a great deal on a case and on a Magnum. And if you're buying online 6 bottles or more, absolutely free delivery. They'll knock on your door, drop it off, and you won't pay a cent beyond what you've been charged for that great South African wine you've taken delivery of. Thank you for joining us. Huge thank you to Christo and Johan. Congratulations again to Johan on that award. Enjoy your weekend. I'll see you next Monday on the back of some 2010 Le Riche. Cheers and goodbye.